We now come to Chapter 34, the R1 Nun verbs. The verbs we've looked at so far, of course, had a guttural in the verb somewhere. But now we're getting away from the weakness of gutturals, and now we're going to look at the weakness of the nun. And this is going to be different than what you're used to looking at. So far, every verb you looked at has always had 3 root letters. Now, with the nun, we're going to have something different because the nun is at times going to assimilate and even at times disappear. And so when that happens, instead of seeing a 3 root verb that you can parse, you're going to be looking at a 2 root verb because of the nun assimilation. And so this is going to cause you an extra problem and something you're going to have to watch out for. Well, the first thing we need to do is talk about the weakness or the sickness or the infirmity of the verb. And that is a nun in the silent schwa position. And this is something you've already seen if you remember the min preposition. That had the same problem, namely when you were attach a min preposition to another word, like for instance, if you want to say from his name, this nun would of course assimilate into the sheen, and you would end up with something like this. And remember, we talked about English also does assimilation, so we don't say illegitimate, we say illegitimate and so forth. So go back and review the chapter that dealt with the min preposition, chapter 9, and you can see that. The problem there was, again, the nun in the silent schwa position, and that's exactly the same problem we're going to have with these verbs. Also, even in the vocal schwa position, there are certain times, especially in the call imperative infinitive construct, that the nun is going to have problems also. But usually, other than those 2 situations, namely the call imperative and infinitive construct, the nun with the vocal schwa will be very stable. There'll be no problem. It's a well form, let's say. Now, the first thing we want to do is look at the strong areas. And so if you look in the back at the chart of the R1 nun verb, you can see there's a lot of strong areas for this verb. The PL, PUAL, HITH-PIAL is always your friend. It only let you down once with the R2 guttural, of course. And the reason why is you're always going to have a short vowel under R1. And that's what makes it strong for your PL, PUAL, and HITH-PIAL. But also, most of the NIFAL is strong also, because if you remember the boxes for this NIFAL, you'd have a dagesh forte in the R1, and you'd have that long kamets under R1. So again, the nun with the long kamets is completely strong. And then you can see even the call, the most dangerous areas, as it were. Even they have some strong areas. You're perfect. You're going to either have a vowel or you're going to have a vocal schwa, so there's no problem. And the infinitive absolute, the same thing, no problem. And your participle, no problem, strong. So again, there's a lot of strong areas here, and that's always very helpful for the student. But now we want to look at areas where we have what's called assimilation. And so our first remedy for the problem of a R1 nun verb is the solution to the sickness, the remedy, is going to be assimilation. And so if you look at section 4, I talk about that. And so look at the call imperfect 3ms. And again, I'm going to write the form out as if it were, this is what you would expect. And of course, I'm going to put a dagesh in the pay, and that would be a dagesh lene. This is what you would expect, but the problem is this nun in the silent schwa position. Hebrew will rarely allow this. It will allow it on if you were to have a guttural in the R2 position. If there was a guttural here in the R2 position, Hebrew will on occasion allow that nun to stay. But usually it does not. And so what will happen is we'll have assimilation, just like again with the min preposition. And so the pay will assimilate the nun. And when that happens, let me just get rid of that, dagesh lene, you're going to end up with something like this. And as you know, Hebrew avoids the writing of consecutive consonants. And so now, let's just go ahead and rewrite it again. And this time, you're going to have a dagesh in the pay, but that's not the dagesh lene that I wrote originally. This is a dagesh forte. And so again, that represents the doubling, the assimilation of the nun. And so that's what we're going to have. And so Again, assimilation is going to be one of the main solutions that we have. And if we go back again to the chart that we have at the end of your chapter, we can see for your Hifil and your Hafal, you will always have assimilation. And for your Nifal perfect and your Nifal participle, you will have assimilation. For your call imperfect, you will have assimilation. And so for all those situations, you're going to just simply assimilate the Nun to the R2, and that will solve the problem. But there's two areas in which we have major problems, and now we want to turn to that. In this situation, we would have the Nun really in a vocal schwa position. But here we've got problems, and the problems are always in the call. The call is always the most difficult. And so now we want to talk about the call, imperative, and infinitive construct. And as we do this, we want to be careful to distinguish between different types of call. We're going to look at a call that has a Kamat Ch.34, which becomes Holem, in the imperfect imperative. And then we're going to look at some others too. We're going to look at ones that have Patach. And we're going to look at one in particular that has a Seire. That will be Natan. And so according to the thematic vowels, that's how we're going to have to deal with these following problems. The first one we want to look at is the root Nafal, which again for your imperative 2ms, you would expect this form here, and that's exactly what you get. And remember, this is going to be an AO verb, which is again the verb you're most familiar with. When you get this holem, or originally Kamat Ch.34 as your thematic vowel, then you're going to get nifol, and it's going to be just like a strong verb. You're going to be very happy about that. But when you go to a verb that is patach patach, when you go to a verb that's patach patach, you're going to get something different. And so we have the word nagash, but not write cursive right now with you, except for the minute, of course. You have nagash, like this. What you would expect, you have the patach, and you would expect this form here. You'd expect this nun to have a vocal schwa and everybody to be happy. But really what happens is the nun goes AWOL. It simply disappears. And now I'm going to put a dagesh here, but that is not the nun assimilating. Because if that's a dagesh forte, you got stuttering in Hebrew, and that's not what you want. That is a dagesh lene because it's a begad kafat letter beginning. The nun simply vanishes. The real reality is that this root was probably originally a biliteral root. The root really only had 2 consonants, but they added a nun on to give it that tri-consonantal look, which is so common in Hebrew. So this imperative 2ms might really be preserving an old biliteral root that you see here, so probably the nun wasn't there to begin with. But for your learning this, I would suggest that you see it as the nun going AWOL on you. And you get it for all patach, imperfect imperatives, and you also get it for the seire one also. And again, right now we're just limiting this to one verbal root, and that's natan, a very important root, natan. And so what you're going to end up with, again, you'd expect something like this. The nun goes AWOL, but again, this root was probably maybe a biliteral root back in the old days. And again, that dagesh should not be seen as the nun assimilating. You cannot have a dagesh forte beginning a word, but that's a dagesh lene, and that is your imperative for that form. And again, you want to think of the nun going AWOL. When we come to the infinitive construct, it gets a little more complicated. And so again, if we're dealing with your usual AO verbs, you expect this form of nifol, and that's exactly what you get. You're happy. It's like a strong verb. Wonderful. Life's good. But when you, again, have the patach as your imperfect imperative, we've got a problem. And so let's look at it. We'll again use nagash. For nagash, we're going to have, again, something different here. It's red, red. You know, that's what I mean by red, red. The red here. Now this again is just the perfect, imperfect, imperative, but this time we are going to think about this for the infinitive construct. The nun, again, is going to go AWOL on us. It's going to not be there. And we're going to have this patach under the gimel. And again, that is not the nun assimilating. That is a bigat kafad. And so we're going to have that nun. And then what they're going to do is they're going to add this t, this tav here. And when they do that, the form looks something like this. And as soon as you see that form, you ought to think about the form malk. Remember the old form malk that we had? Let me just replace this for just a second. You had this form, and as you know, that develops into melech, a seglet formation, and it's the same thing with this form. You're going to end up with a seglet formation. Again, this is what originally was. And then what they're going to do is insert the kudzu in the segol, like so. And then before long, the kudzu gets out of control. And you get the segol. And you now have a seglet noun, but it's really a call infinitive construct of nagash. And that's going to take you a while to get used to. But again, get rid of the nun, it goes AWOL. Add the T and do the seglet formation, and you're going to get it. And this is going to be an I seglet. So perhaps instead of using the patach like I did, perhaps in the formation, I really should have made it not like melech, but really like sefer. That would have been better. And so really, you're looking at something like this perhaps, and then going to the segols. But when you have a pronominal suffix like gishti, when you do this, add the pronominal, the 1cs pronominal suffix, you're going to get the original hirik back here. And again, instead of using melech, that was not a good example, you should associate it really with this form here, sifri. See, that's the form you need to associate it with because of the I here. Okay, so with that one now, we can go on now to the AE, namely, again, the natan form. And again, when we do natan, we have something, here's your root, the nun is going to go AWOL on us. And now we're going to add another tav here at the end. And once we do that, and again, this one will be, again, an I, meaning hirik. And so the original vowel here is a hirik. And then again, you have what would be a seglet formation. But you got the nun in the silent schwa position. So before the seglet process can begin, that nun in the silent schwa position will be assimilated by this tav, by the final tav. And so really what we're going to have is a hovering dagesh. And that hovering dagesh represents the R3 nun of the root natan. You see that nun right there. That's the hovering dagesh. Now, so the form will not go to a seglet formation. And when we have the accent, it's now closed accented. Hebrew prefers a long vowel. We will get a seire. And you can see that's a dagesh, again, lene, that I'm putting in there, not the nun. But yet, if we were to put a pronominal suffix, like a 1cs, at the end here, then the hovering dagesh can now land. And now this syllable, of course the accent would be shifted. This syllable now, get rid of the hovering dagesh. This syllable is now closed and accented. Hebrew requires a short vowel, and so you go back to the original hirik. And so let me get rid of all this mess and write it so that you can read it more clearly, and you end up with something like this, titi, like that. Okay, so that's the, this would be a 1cs pronominal suffix on a call infinitive construct. This would be something like my giving. And so that's how you'd want to translate that, or when I gave, if you had a certain ending on it. I also wanted to, on these forms, think of, let's go back to the form with the hovering dagesh, tet. And there's a hovering dagesh there. If you were to put the lamed, which again is very common with infinitive constructs, oftentimes what you're going to get is you're going to get a long kametz. And of course you'll have to get rid of the dagesh lene there. Because you see the inseparable preposition lamed in the pretonic open position will often get the long kametz in this situation. And the same thing with geshet, la geshet. You're going to get the original patach is in a pretonic open position and it lengthens, and so that's why you're going to get this. Okay, so watch out for the imperative, call imperative and infinitive construct, especially with verbs that are AA and AE. You've got to watch out for those. Now we have final considerations. So look at section 5, and you'll see the first of the final considerations. If you have an R3 nun, when it's in the silent schwa position, it can also assimilate. And so if you look at a word, again, like Natan, and let's make it a call perfect 1CS, you would expect a form something like this. But that nun, again, is in the silent schwa position. And so as you can see here, this is a dagesh lene. But when the nun is assimilated into it, and now we have this form, now it's a dagesh forte, representing the assimilation of the R3 nun. So you have to watch out for that form. The second, or those types of forms. The second final consideration you need to know about is a specific verb, lakach, to take. It's very common in Hebrew. And it's a R1 lamed, R3 chet. So this would be what I would call a doubly weak verb. But with this form, in the call imperfect, the call imperative, and the call infinitive construct, lakach really thinks it's nakach. It's a schizophrenic form. You know, we are dealing here with weaknesses and all sorts of sicknesses, and this time we're dealing with schizophrenia here. The form, even though it's lakach, thinks it's nakach for just, again, just the call imperfect, imperative, and infinitive construct. You get this. And so what we're going to get in imperfects is we're going to get assimilation for the call imperfect. The thematic vowel would have to be a patach. How do I know that? Because I've got an R3 chet there. That's why. And so again, you would assimilate this nun, and it would look something like this, yikach. Now, for the imperative, the lamed, acting like a nun again, is simply going to disappear, and this is the call imperative to a mess, kach, just like this. And so that's the problem. If we were to have a 2FS, then we're going to get something like kachi and so forth, kachu and those forms. If we do the infinitive construct, again, the lamed, like the nun, will go awol. We're going to add the T, and again, you're going to get a patach with that chet in particular. And then you're going to have the seglet formation. And of course, I would tell you that. You're going to have a seglet formation, and so you're going to end up with a form that looks like this, kachat. And again, if you put a lamed on the front of this, if you put a lamed on the front, frequently you're going to get the long kametz, la kachat. And again, it becomes like a seglet noun. And then again, if we're going to have a pronominal suffix, you're going to get something like this, kachti. And notice here I'm giving it with a silent schwa because I believe it mostly takes a silent schwa in that position. So kachti is what I would expect. All right, and then finally, one other root that you need to watch out for is nasa. And again, you can see this is also a doubly weak. You've got an R1 nun and an R3 aleph, so it's doubly weak, and you have to watch out for that. But the reason I give you this, again, a very common root, but look at the call infinitive construct. It can either be sate or sa'ate, and that's somewhat irregular. You have to watch out for that one. And so just memorize that call infinitive construct of nasa. It's very common in the Hebrew Old Testament, so keep your eye out for that. All right, and now we want to look at forming and parsing R1 Nun verbs. And so look at the first example that I give you. A HIFL perfect 1CS. And again, we're dealing with an R1 weakness, and therefore the problem is going to be in the first syllable usually. And so the boxes is what's going to be affected. And so with a HIFL perfect, again, you know your box looks something like this. But with the Nun being in the R1 position and the silent schwa, what I'm going to look for is something more like this, you see. And again, in the assimilation here in the R2, you've got this Dagesh forte, which represents the Nun with the silent schwa. So keep that in mind. So that's going to really be the box as we work it out. The colors will not be affected, and the call, again, will be the same. And so we're ready to go. And so the first thing is, again, the boxes. And so you would expect, again, this. But the Nun is going to assimilate into the pei. And so this would be my beginning. The next is the colors. And again, the colors would look like this. And I'm dealing with a 1CS, so I need the patach, so I'll put the patach there. And then again, it's a 1CS katal T, so I'll put the T here at the end and just move over this. And that's exactly what I expect. Hipalti is the answer here. Okay, that's what I'm showing you as the first example. Then you can see the call infinitive construct. I give you that as the next one. Again, I think you can follow that. And then I do a parsing one. Let's look at number 3, which is a parsing. And let's look at parsing here. Here's the form. The first thing you want to do is you want to look for boxes, of course, because in parsing, it's a process of elimination. And we go through the same steps. Boxes, colors, call. Well, the first thing we want to do is go for boxes. And as you look at this, immediately what would come to most people's minds, and I mean it'd be very accurate, is a box that looked like a PL perfect box. Because when you look at this, that looks just like a PL perfect box. And so immediately I would be thinking in terms of PL perfect. But then the next thing is I got to come to colors. And when I come to the colors, how do you explain the kamets? And the answer is you can't explain it. And therefore, this box is incorrect. And therefore, when you see the so-called PL box, it really could be something else. And what it could be is it could be hiding another Nun. And so what we could be looking at is something like this. And indeed, if that's what it is, well, that's another box. And that is a box that looks like, and I'm shortening the box for you, the front of the box looks like this. That's a nifal. And as we go to nifal, it might be a little easier to explain. What we have here is this kamets. And when we think about the colors of the nifal, obviously the perfect, imperfect imperative, that's not going to help us. We come down to the infinitives, that's really not going to help. But when we get to the participle, it's an irreducible long kamets, and that's exactly what that is, you see. An irreducible long kamets. And so what has happened is this Nun has assimilated into the gimel. As I have it written here, that gimel has a Dagesh lene. Once you assimilate this Nun, that's a Dagesh forte. And so again, as we look at the boxes, it becomes more challenging now than it has before. Sometimes a box may look like a PL perfect, when in reality, what you see is some type of assimilation. And so we've got to be very careful. So the boxes, somewhat vague. We have to go to the next step. And when we went to the colors, that really solved it. And then if we go to the call, it's really not going to help, because a call, again, only helps us with performatives and subformatives. And so what we have here is a nifal participle, masculine singular absolute. And so again, that's one of the complications that we definitely have to look out for. Well, that's chapter 34, the R1 Nun. Now you need to, of course, look at the questions and do the drills.